Usually when we talk about a rock star, there's a certain expectation of character categorization. Like, we really like to put people in these easily identifiable boxes.
Right, it makes them easier to understand.
Exactly. The front man is the raging ego,
Mm.
and the drummer is the unpredictable wild card. You're either loud or you're quiet. You're either the visionary leader or you are the loyal follower.
Yeah, it is a very binary way of looking at fame. I mean, we want our pop culture to be visible and just easily digestible from a distance.
But then you step into the world of George Harrison, and suddenly, like, every single one of those neat little boxes just gets completely crushed. You know him as the quiet Beatle. But think about the sheer volume of contradictions in that label for a second.
Oh, the label is completely absurd when you look at the actual history.
Right. I mean, how quiet is a man who gets deported from Germany for playing illegal club gigs? How quiet is a guy who organizes the world's first massive rock charity concert, gets sued for subconsciously stealing a massive hit song, and literally mortgages his sprawling mansion just to fund a controversial comedy about a reluctant messiah?
You look at those actions and the whole illusion of the silent, passive background player, it just shatters completely. I mean, it is the absolute definition of a beautifully contradictory life.
So today we are taking a deep dive into George Harrison. And for you listening, we are not just going to recite a chronological list of Beatles trivia. We're going on a story-driven exploration of a man who reached the absolute, undisputed pinnacle of Western fame and material success, only to spend the rest of his life looking toward the East, his garden, and the spiritual realm.
It's a fascinating pivot.
It really is. And I promise that by the time we finish this deep dive, you will never listen to something or Here Comes the Sun the exact same way again.
Because, the music doesn't exist in a vacuum. To really understand those records, you have to understand the specific and honestly often painful forces that forged the man making them.
Right. So before we get to the global superstardom, the screaming fans and the Maharishis,
Yeah.
we have to look at the foundation. And I mean an incredibly humble, gritty foundation that anchored him for his entire life.
Yeah, George was born in 1943 in Wavertree, Liverpool. This was at 12 Arnold Grove. To picture this, you really have to imagine a tiny, cramped, terraced house on a cul-de-sac.
Just a classic working class setup.
Exactly. Post-war Britain was incredibly bleak. The family had an outdoor toilet, and the only heat in the entire house came from a single coal fire in the main room. His father was a bus conductor, so, material wealth was virtually non-existent.
But his mother, Louise, was a massive, enthusiastic music fan. And she had this fascinating habit while she was pregnant with George.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite details.
She would deliberately tune the radio to these weekly broadcasts of mystical Indian music. Like, she literally hoped that the exotic sounds of sitars and tablas floating through the radio waves would bring peace to the baby in her womb.
It is an incredible piece of foreshadowing, isn't it? And despite the lack of money, his mother supported his musical obsessions early on. She actually bought him his very first guitar for £3.10.
Which was probably a lot of money for them at the time.
Oh, huge. His father, understandably, wanted him to focus on a secure trade. But in early 1956, George had a total epiphany. He was riding his bicycle down the street, and from an open window of a nearby house, he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel blasting out.
It just rewired his brain on the spot. He starts drawing guitars in the margins of his school books. He becomes completely obsessed. And that obsession leads us to what has to be the most unconventional job interview in music history.
Right, so George meets Paul McCartney on the bus to school, and they instantly bond over music. Eventually, Paul brings George to audition for John Lennon, and at the time, John is fronting a skiffle group called the Quarrymen.
And for the listener who might not know what skiffle is, think of it as like DIY post-war punk rock before punk even existed. Kids in Britain couldn't afford expensive electric guitars and drum kits, so they just made music with whatever was lying around.
Yeah, washboards, teach-us spaces.
Exactly. And acoustic guitars played really aggressively. It was raw, it was scrappy.
And John Lennon was the undisputed, slightly intimidating leader of this scrappy group. So Paul brings George to audition, but John flat out rejects him on sight. Not because of his playing, but because George is just a 15-year-old kid.
Which is huge at that age. When you're a teenager, a 2 or 3 year age gap feels like this insurmountable generational divide.
Right.
So, okay, let's unpack this for a second. Imagine you're walking into the biggest, highest stakes job interview of your life. But instead of sitting in a polished boardroom, you are standing on the upper deck of a moving, rattling Liverpool bus. and your entire resume consists of perfectly nailing the complex guitar riff to an instrumental song called Raunchy.
It's just such a great visual.
That is how Paul sets up George's second audition. They just ambush John on the bus.
And the choice of the song Raunchy is really vital here, too. It wasn't just a basic chord progression. It required precise picking and a real understanding of rock and roll rhythm, which was, frankly, rare for a British kid to nail at that time.
Right, so John was impressed.
Incredibly impressed by the playing. But more importantly, George just kept showing up. He would bring his guitar and stand in the back of the room. If someone didn't show for a gig, George filled in. He basically just wore them down.
He practically willed himself into the band through sheer proximity and stubbornness.
And you see that exact same tenacity when the band finally gets a gig playing the club circuit in Hamburg, Germany.
Oh, right, the Reeperbahn.
Yeah, and the Reeperbahn in Hamburg was rough. Gangsters, sailors, endless grueling sets playing 8 hours a night. And halfway through their stint, the authorities discovered George is legally too young to be working in the country.
Because he's still a teenager.
Right. So he is physically deported back to England. And, most teenagers would have given up, gone back to school, listened to their dad. George just waited it out, practiced, and rejoined them the absolute second he was legally allowed.
So the foundation is set, they get a manager, they sign to EMI, and Beatlemania sweeps the globe. Suddenly, they are the four most recognizable faces on the planet. And almost immediately, the media assigns George a label that would follow him to his grave. The Quiet Beatle.
It's the label everyone knows.
Right. But if you look at the mechanism of how that nickname actually started, it wasn't born from some deep, brooding introversion at all.
No, not at all. It was a purely physiological accident. When the Beatles arrived in the United States in early 1964 for their massive American debut, George was incredibly sick.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, he had a high fever and a terrible case of strep throat. A doctor gave him strict orders to preserve his vocal cords so he could physically make it through their performance on The Ed Sullivan Show.
So picture these press conferences. You have hundreds of flashing cameras, reporters screaming questions. John and Paul are cracking these brilliantly witty, sarcastic jokes, and George is just standing there, literally biting his tongue so he doesn't ruin his throat.
And in the absence of a vocal presence, the press room just filled in the blank themselves. They wrote the narrative, oh, he's the quiet, mysterious one. And it stuck instantly.
But if you are literally forbidden from speaking to the press, you have to find another way to make noise. You have to find a new voice. Especially because within the band, the Lennon and McCartney songwriting machine was churning out pop hits at a terrifying, unmatchable rate.
They were juggernaut.
George was completely sidelined vocally and compositionally. He desperately needed an identity.
And he found it during an American tour when David Crosby of the Byrds introduced him to Indian classical music and the recordings of the sitar maestro, Ravi Shankar.
And this wasn't just a new sound for George Rada. It was an entirely new musical philosophy.
Exactly. He takes this discovery and uses the sitar on the song Norwegian Wood. And Ravi Shankar later noted that this specific recording triggered what became known as the Great Sitar Explosion in rock music. Every band from London to Los Angeles suddenly wanted to sound Eastern.
George completely opened a cultural floodgate. He introduced the drone of the tambura to Western pop music on the track Tomorrow Never Knows, and he wrote fully Indian-styled compositions like Love You Too.
It was revolutionary for pop radio.
I want to clarify something for the listener here, though. When we say the drone of the tambura, we are talking about a completely different way of building a song. Western music is all about chord progressions, right? Moving from a C chord to a G chord to an F chord to tell a story.
Right. Western music is very linear in that way.
But Indian classical music often uses a drone, which is this continuous, hypnotic, unchanging background note that anchors the entire piece while the melody dances over it. It really pulls the listener into a trance. But I do have to push back on George's role in all of this. Did he actually master the sitar? Or was this just a wealthy Western pop star playing dress-up with an exotic instrument because it was trendy?
That is the crucial line between cultural appropriation and genuine appreciation. George realized very quickly how incredibly difficult the sitar is to play.
It's not just a big guitar.
Not at all. You don't just hold it like a guitar. You have a massive gourd resonating against your foot. You wear a wire plectrum on your index finger that practically shreds your skin. You are navigating curved frets and 20 strings while sitting cross-legged for hours. It is physically agonizing and mathematically complex.
So he was bleeding for it.
Literally bleeding. And to his credit, he approached it with deep humility. He traveled to India, bought an authentic sitar in New Delhi, and studied intensely under Shankar. He even hid out on a houseboat in Kashmir just to escape the fans and practice.
That is dedication.
But by 1968, he sat down with Shankar and confessed, "I'm not going to be a great sitar player. I should have started 15 years ago." He accepted that his primary voice would always be the guitar.
That takes a lot of self-awareness.
It really does. But ethnomusicologists universally praise his work because he treated the music as a profound spiritual discipline, not a cheap parody. He championed the culture with absolute respect.
And this deep immersion into Indian philosophy triggers a massive spiritual awakening for him. His songwriting is maturing at light speed. He is pulling in these grand concepts of ego, reincarnation, and detachment. But that immense personal growth puts him on a direct collision course with the tight, suffocating constraints of the Beatles.
Oh, the internal band tension became unbearable. George is stockpiling dozens of brilliant world-class songs, but John and Paul are still treating him like the kid on the bus. They're rationing him strictly to 2 or 3 tracks per album.
It's like he was a master architect who spent a decade helping John and Paul build their mansions. But he was only ever allowed to design the guest houses. He was capable of building a cathedral, but they simply wouldn't give him the land.
That is a perfect way to look at it. And it all boils over in 1969 during the Let It Be sessions. You can actually see this on film. The atmosphere in the studio is freezing cold.
It's so tense to watch.
Very. John is completely disengaged. Paul is actively micromanaging George's guitar solos, and George finally hits his breaking point. He just stands up and quits.
He walks out. He literally leaves the biggest band in the world and goes home.
He is gone for 12 days. He does eventually return, but the power dynamic has shifted. He asserts his boundaries, and the result is the Abbey Road album, where he delivers absolute, undeniable masterpieces. He gives them Here Comes the Sun and Something.
The cultural impact of Something is staggering. I mean, Frank Sinatra, who was not exactly throwing out compliments to long-haired rock bands, recorded it and publicly called it the greatest love song of the past 50 years.
Even John Lennon had to admit it was the best track on the album.
George had finally proved he was an equal, but the confines of the band were still too tight. When the Beatles finally break up in 1970, George doesn't just quietly fade away. He unleashes All Things Must Pass.
Right, which is just a monumental release.
A triple album. Because he had been a creative pressure cooker for so long, when the lid finally came off, he had enough top-tier material to fill 3 records. And he teams up with the producer, Phil Spector, to use his famous wall of sound technique.
Which was a total departure from the Beatles' sound.
Yeah, and for anyone who isn't a deep audiophile, the wall of sound basically means recording dozens of instruments in a highly reverberant room. You pack 3 drum kits, 5 pianos, and an army of acoustic guitars into one space, and you let all the sound bleed into the microphones together. It creates this massive, overwhelming acoustic roar.
It was the exact opposite of the tight 4-piece Beatles sound. And All Things Must Pass was an absolute triumph. It was critically acclaimed and topped the charts globally. But his new solo superstardom came with a brutal, exhausting reality check.
Right, the lawsuit.
Yeah, the biggest hit from that album, My Sweet Lord, led to a grueling, years-long copyright infringement lawsuit.
This is the lawsuit over the 1963 hit He's So Fine by the Chiffons.
Yeah.
Imagine achieving your ultimate masterpiece, finally proving everyone who doubted you wrong, and then a judge bangs a gavel and tells you that your greatest achievement was accidentally stolen. How does a court even prove subconscious plagiarism musically?
Well, the legal mechanics of copyright law focus on 2 things, access and substantial similarity. George obviously had access to He's So Fine because it was a massive radio hit.
Everyone knew that song.
Right. And the similarity came down to specific musical intervals. The Chiffons song had a very distinct 3-note musical motif, followed immediately by a 5-note motif. When the court analyzed My Sweet Lord, they found it used the exact same intervals in the exact same sequence.
So it's the exact same mathematical pattern.
Yes. The judge ruled that George had not deliberately set out to steal the song, but because he was so immersed in pop music, his brain had simply stored that melody, and when he went to write his own spiritual anthem, his subconscious fed it back to him as an original idea.
Wow.
The financial penalty was massive, but the psychological toll was worse. Every single note he produced going forward was going to be examined under a microscope.
Which is just paralyzing for a songwriter. So if you have conquered the music world twice, and the industry has exhausted you with lawsuits and internal politics. What do you do next? Well, for George, you take your massive material wealth and platform and you start using it to save lives.
Yeah. In 1971, Ravi Shankar comes to George deeply distressed. There is a devastating humanitarian crisis, starving refugees fleeing the Bangladesh Liberation War, compounded by a deadly cyclone.
Just a horrific situation.
Shankar suggests doing a small benefit concert to raise maybe $25,000. George looks at the situation and decides to completely scale it up.
He organizes the concert for Bangladesh at Madison Square Garden. And the mechanism of how he did this is fascinating. He didn't just ask people to play, he leveraged his address book. He brings in Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Ringo Starr, Billy Preston. It drew over 40,000 people across 2 shows.
Before this, rock concerts were just entertainment. George established the structural blueprint for Live Aid and every massive charity rock show that followed. He proved that rock and roll could act as a viable vehicle for global humanitarian aid.
And then, years later, he takes an entirely different, highly unusual swing with his wealth. He ventures into the British film industry by creating HandMade Films.
Right, and this starts with Monty Python's Life of Brian. EMI Films had originally agreed to back the movie, but literally days before shooting was supposed to start, their chief executive reads the script, deems it incredibly blasphemous and controversial, and pulls all the funding.
So the movie is completely dead in the water because no traditional bank will loan money against a religious comedy.
Exactly. So George steps in. And he doesn't just write a check from a slush fund. He literally mortgages his sprawling Friar Park estate to fund the movie himself.
Wait, I'm struggling to understand this. He is this deeply spiritual man, aggressively trying to detach from the material world and his ego, yet he leverages his massive material home to fund a deeply cynical, irreverent comedy. How do those 2 sides of his brain coexist?
Because for George, humor was spiritual. Monty Python kept him sane during the darkest days of the Beatles' breakup. The simple logic behind mortgaging his house was that he just wanted to see the movie get made.
That's incredible.
Eric Idle famously called it the most anyone has ever paid for a cinema ticket.
But the ripple effect of that one decision changed British cinema, didn't it?
Absolutely. By proving that you didn't need the major studio system if you had private maverick funding, HandMade Films created a pipeline for independent British cinema. They went on to produce classics like Time Bandits and With Nail and I. He basically became a one-man studio greenlight for eccentric creatives who couldn't get funded anywhere else.
He was a cultural catalyst behind the scenes. But despite this massive impact in film and philanthropy, George actively tried to retreat from the public eye. He wanted to focus on his garden, his wife Olivia, and his son Donnie. But fate, or the universe, just kept dragging him back into extraordinary situations.
Sometimes entirely by accident, yeah. Like, in 1988, George is told by his record company that he urgently needs to record a throwaway B-side for a European single.
Okay.
He casually gets together in Bob Dylan's garage with Jeff Lynne, Roy Orbison, and Tom Petty just to lay down a quick track.
Just a casual Tuesday afternoon jam session with 5 of the greatest songwriters in human history? No big deal.
Right. And they record a song called Handle with Care. When the record executives hear it, they refuse to use it as a B-side because it's too good. They tell George to go back and make a full album.
So, these legends adopt pseudonyms. George became Melson Wilbury, and they release a triple platinum supergroup album, The Traveling Wilburys, purely born out of spontaneous friendship and zero commercial pressure.
It is a beautiful late career triumph, but, the final years of his life also took a deeply dark and horrifying turn.
Yeah, this is the really tough part of the story.
In December 1999, the ultimate safe haven he had built for himself, his Friar Park estate, was violently breached. A 34-year-old man, who was later diagnosed with schizophrenia, broke into the home in the middle of the night. He made his way up to George and Olivia's bedroom.
And he wasn't there to steal anything, was he?
No. He attacked George with a kitchen knife. George, who was in his late 50s at the time, fought back fiercely, but he suffered serious head injuries and was stabbed deeply in the chest, puncturing his lung.
God, that's terrifying.
George later recounted that he could literally hear the air exhaling from his punctured lung and tasted blood, genuinely believing he was dying right there in his hallway.
And the only reason he survived is because his wife, Olivia, charged the attacker. She repeatedly struck him with a heavy fireplace poker and a brass lamp until he was incapacitated.
It was profoundly traumatic. George, leaning on his characteristic dark humor, later released a statement saying the attacker wasn't a burglar, and he certainly wasn't auditioning for the Traveling Wilburys.
That is just classic George, making a joke out of it.
Yeah, but those closest to him deeply believed that the intense physical and psychological trauma of that night depleted his reserves and likely precipitated the aggressive return of his cancer.
The cancer does return. It spreads to his lungs and brain, and he passes away in November 2001 at the age of 58. But when you look at the very end of his life, there's an incredible duality that completely synthesizes who he was.
How do you mean?
Well, on one hand, you have his final profound message to the world, relayed by his family. He said, "Everything else can wait, but the search for God cannot wait, and love one another." He passed away surrounded by his family and Hare Krishna devotees, softly chanting verses from the Bhagavad Gita. It is a deeply transcendent exit.
It is incredibly peaceful.
But on the other hand, right around the exact same time from his deathbed, he sends a package to the comedian Mike Myers. George had spent weeks searching all over Europe to find a specific Dr. Evil doll to mail to him, just to thank him for the Austin Powers movies because they made him laugh so hard.
That's amazing.
He is simultaneously this deeply ascendant spiritual seeker and a guy who loves goofy toilet humor and fast Formula One racing cars.
He navigated those extremes because he didn't view them as mutually exclusive. George understood the utter fragility of existence. He frequently quoted Indian texts describing life as being fragile like a raindrop on a lotus leaf.
Wow, that's beautiful.
He lived fully and joyfully in the material world. I mean, he loved his cars, his massive gardens, his friends, but he was equally deeply rooted in the spiritual world. He moved between both without ever letting either completely define or trap him.
It is an incredible, sprawling arc. From a Wavertree kid freezing in a house with a single coal fire to a global icon who reached the absolute zenith of human fame, yet always felt a little bit like an alien visiting Earth. I think it is incredibly telling that he dedicated his autobiography, I, Me, Mine, to gardeners everywhere.
Because stripped of the fame, the lawsuits, and the labels, that is exactly what he was. He was a cultivator. He nurtured a new sound in popular music. He cultivated a global charitable movement. He grew an independent film industry. And he physically planted thousands of trees on his 36-acre estate. He left the soil richer than he found it.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you listening. Think about how we consume music and culture today. We live in an era governed by algorithms that reward the loudest, most aggressive, most constant self-promoters.
It's all about making noise now.
Right. It leaves you wondering if a quiet, slow-burning 15-year-old kid from Liverpool existed today, sitting in the back of the room and waiting his turn. Would the modern machinery of fame even let him be discovered? Or have we built a culture where the quiet Beatles of the world are simply drowned out by the noise before they ever get the chance to pick up a sitar?
We constantly look for the clean and binary X-ray of a person, the loud one or the quiet one.
But when you look past that easy, digestible label, you find a life that defied every boundary. You find a life that was brilliantly, beautifully loud in all the ways that actually matter. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.